The beast, in my opinion, if you read in Revelation chapter 11, clearly states that he was the one, the angel of the abyss, it's just now called the beast, came forth from the abyss. And here now suddenly he's described as a great ruler, especially in chapter 13, conquering the world and so forth. And in my opinion, he is basically a Nephilim Messiah. So what I found from the earliest of times, the concept of the Messiah was not only associated with later on with biblical tradition. In ancient Mesopotamia, the idea of the Messiah was already developed. And it was also associated with the Nephilim lineage.
Well, hey, everybody, I'm Joshua.
And I'm Caleb.
And we're brothers.
Bearded Bible brothers.
We have beards. I mean, our microphone has a beard. I think this just makes perfect sense. And we are continuing to talk about a topic that is incredibly interesting to me. And because I struggle with one-syllable words, it felt imperative to bring on a man who knows even bigger than one-syllable words. But if you don't trust me, we're talking about PhDs and master's degrees and all kinds of backup here that proves that this guy, well, he knows what he's talking about. Caleb, who are we talking with today?
Willem McLoud, it is an honor to have you on our program. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Absolutely.
You have an incredible accent. You kind of sound like a bad guy on James Bond, but I know for a fact that you're not. Tell me where you're sitting right now, because it's not in Texas.
Yeah, I'm sitting in the Strand. It's a small town near Cape Town. So I'm actually a South African, and my accent is typical of South Africans my age.
It's a beautiful accent.
And you have quite an amazing pedigree of research. You know, you have a PhD, 3 masters. Your degrees in like nuclear physics, you understand quantum physics, everything that's beyond our understanding, but somehow it interlinks with your recent study on the Nephilim. You've written books about the Nephilim. You have traveled the globe to study the Nephilim. I just want to understand tell us a little bit about your background and your research and eventually how did that come to this, this peak of interest in this biblical and ancient historical story?
Yeah, so the primeval history was also always of great interest to me. You know, the primeval history, it's just such a strange kind of document. You know, the literary style are different from the rest of Genesis. That's Genesis 1 to 11. That's what we call the primeval history. And how should we understand that? That's a major question, and scholars have debated that for such a long time already. And so I had a deep interest in that. Also the rest of the book of Genesis, and then also other aspects of Scripture, but especially also the book of Revelation. So the beginning and the end, you know, those two things always are always sort of mysterious to the human race. So in my research regarding the ancient world from which the Bible originated, I was influenced by a scholar, for example, like David Rohl, which done a lot of work with regard to extra-biblical traditions that correlate to the biblical tradition. So for me, as a scholar, it's important to not only understand that the Bible originated from an ancient world, a world very, very different from our own, with totally different worldview that we have, but also that what we read about in the Bible is often also referred to in extra-biblical sources. So it came from a world in which the Bible was not always the only source with regard to those events. Now, the primeval history is very difficult because it's such in my view, a very ancient traditions that we were looking at. And what was interesting to me was that the Mesopotamian world, and there's such a lot of Mesopotamian material, that's been incorporated into the pre-biblical history. So why would the Mesopotamian world play such an important role? And then eventually I came to the point of coming to the reason that Abraham came from Ur in Sumer. Now Shinar is just the land of Sumer, and he came from Ur. Maybe there was the answer.
Yes.
And in time, I actually developed what I call the Sumerian hypothesis. It was also published in a peer-reviewed journal, in which I propose that the pre-biblical history was actually the source material that was brought to the Abrahamic family from the land of Sumer with them when they came to Canaan, and was later on used by biblical authors. And so it's actually very old material that we are talking about. Now, there are two things that's very important. The one is, so often we understand, the Sumerian history as the Sumerians lived in Sumer. Now, that's definitely true. But just to the north of Sumer, there lived the Semites, for example, in the city of Kish, from the earliest of times. The dynasty that's associated with Kish in the Sumerian tradition is, without any doubt, a Semitic dynasty from the earliest of times. And that means that the Semites were present within ancient Mesopotamia from before writing was discovered. So the Abrahamic family and their forebears most likely lived in the land. So it was a shared tradition. It was not that they borrowed something from the Sumerians. It was their tradition. It was a shared tradition that the early Semites and the Sumerians shared with each other. So I think that's very important to understand. And then what I also discovered was that there was absolutely no Babylonian material, Babylonian per se,
Wow.
In the pre-biblical history. So that, I think, makes quite a strong case for the tradition being very old and going back. Now, the Babylonian period, we talk about the old Babylonian period, usually that is regarded to start with Hammurabi, more or less. Now, I use, for ancient Mesopotamia, I use a high chronology. It's actually more complicated, but I also published an entire paper on chronology of the ancient Middle East. I proposed a new model, but that's a theme for another day. So, so what is important in this case is the story of Abraham in the Bible. There's a lot of discussion about, when Abraham lived, because depending on the text that you use, you'll find different dates. But what I discovered is that the Septuagint dates for Abraham are very well aligned with the secular dates that we find. Now, usually in most cases, we have different chronologies. We have a high, a middle, and a low, and even an ultra-low chronology. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, we have a high and a low chronology. Now, we have discovered in the Mari texts that, for example, the story about the Elamites that came to in Genesis 14, that came to the land of Canaan. For a long time, scholars believed, that was those late traditions. There's no truth to it. And at that time, some of the great scholars really spent a lot of time trying to figure it out and find an historical base, Albright and others. But eventually they gave up. But the Mari text, which was discovered and eventually published in detail, suddenly we find that indeed the Elamites did rule northern Mesopotamia for about 2 years. And this was in the time of Abram. And so now we have a good correlation, between biblical and extra-biblical tradition. And once we put these two together, we have quite a secure link, I believe, chronologically speaking. And that's, in my opinion, that falls in the Eastern Larsa period. That's just before the time of Hammurabi, time of Abram. according to the Septuagint, the date that I'm using is Abram leaving Haran in about 1836. So, and Hammurabi becoming overlord of all of Mesopotamia in 1818. That's not long after that. So that's more or less the background. So once we see that, we can understand if the source material were brought with Abram and his family from Sumer, we do not expect Babylonian influences, because the Babylonian conquest of the land and rule of the land came slightly later. And this is exactly, there's no Babylonian influence in the pre-medieval history per se. I'm not talking about Mesopotamian influence or Sumerian influence or Akkadian, but Babylonian per se, there's no such influence whatsoever.
Well, Willem, this is interesting. You talking about the Sumerian influence going back to Abram, and we have cuneiform tablets, the infamous Sumerian Kings list. There are several copies of them discovered, and some of those copies showed that there were pre-flood kings. There was talk about this worldwide deluge, and there was kings that lived before this deluge, in this area of Sumer. And, that would be the assumption of the line of Cain that was before the flood. And we get this narrative, this story, this is where it's all culminating in, with the sons of God coming down and mating with the daughters of men and creating this race of Nephilim. And in the Sumerian text, we hear about the Anunnaki and the gods and how they established and set up these kings to rule. How is this all connected with the Bible, with your research?
So the Sumerian king list, that's not an easy text to engage with. We should just understand that. There are basically two king lists. There are usually the well-known king list. That king list was probably produced just before, at the beginning of the Earth 3 period. In my chronology, that's about 2100 BC. So during the Sumerian Renaissance, that was the final phase of the Sumerians. At the end of the Earth 3 period, the Sumerian civilization came to an end. Then came what we call the Isin Larsa period that I've just mentioned, where Isin and Larsa, two cities subsequently played a very important role in southern Mesopotamia before the Babylonians took over. So the king list. So the first king list, the one I'm talking about, was created during this period and edited during the Isin Larsa period. And they divided, put the flood into this arrangement that they have, similar to what we find in the Bible. In fact, what we find in the Sumerian king list, this Sumerian king list, and the pre-medieval history in Genesis is very, very similar, the literary styles. And this is one reason to believe that it actually dates from that time, because it's extremely difficult for me to believe that somebody would, at a much later age, write something in a literary style that's so old. So take, for example, the genealogies. Both of them have lots of genealogies. What they also have is this short anecdotes, short descriptions of certain heroic deeds and so forth associated with certain people. For example, Enoch, just a short sentence or so that's added, or Nimrod or so. Find exactly the same in the king list. What we also find in the king list is these long ages, people living to really long, becoming really, really old. That we find in both cases. But in both cases, we find that Sumer is an important land where things happened. For example, Uruk, city of Uruk, is a city that Erech is also later on called in the biblical tradition. That's a place where Nimrod actually ruled. And also in the Sumerian tradition, we have some persons, I believe, for example, that Enmerkar, he was a great, during the great heroic period, most likely directly after the deluge, his story and even his name, because if we can take the consonants NMR, very similar to Nimrod. The vowels, that change all the time, but the root of the name stays the same. So there's quite a few scholars that believe that Nimrod corresponds with Merkar in the Sumerian tradition. And this is now where things get interesting, because this dynasty, this Mesopotamian dynasty, the one that Merkar is part of, believed themselves to have been descendants of the gods.
Yes.
So suddenly here, very much, Nimrod in the biblical tradition is basically, in my opinion, from the very same dynasty. It's just two retellings of the same story. As I've said, this information goes back to the same period, same peoples living in the same land. And from that perspective, it's quite significant that the Nephilim is described at that time, before and after the deluge. And I think the way that they're presented as men of fame, famous men of old, most, in my opinion, it will be very strange if the author didn't have Nimrod in mind, among others, because he is described as a famous person.
Yes, mighty hunter before the Lord.
Yeah, a mighty hunter. So, so that shows, this now we're beginning to get a close correspondence and on quite a nice grounding for relating these two traditions. And we understand why it is in the Bible. We can say a lot about the sons of God, but let's first leave it at that.
Yeah.
I find it interesting, this topic specifically. So many people today discount the Bible because they say, that religion is a fairy tale. And you said before we started, the Bible wasn't written in a vacuum, right? It was written in a real world, at a real time period, which means there are other texts that exist that back up the same stories, which is what you're telling us right here. Here are all these other ancient texts that when you look at them side by side, they're all saying the same thing. And they may have different spellings for names and different things like that, but the constants remain the same. So now we have this establishment of a history that's proved both in the secular realm and in the Bible. And then we have your interest in it, which is so fascinating to me. But you didn't just stick with studying the text. You actually went out into the field and did your research. Tell me about what you did when you stepped out past the text and you decided to go to these locations and do more research.
Yeah, so once because of my interest in the ancient world and later on the Nephilim, I actually came to the conclusion that the story of the Nephilim is a continuous story. There's a continuous tradition that we can follow from the earliest of times, even before we had the first written texts.
Yes.
Now remember, again, the date of the flood is very important, because if you want to link biblical tradition or secular tradition, you should compare apples with apples, you see. And that's very important. But so what I've mentioned just earlier is that the Septuagint date is the one that allows us to align with secular tradition. So whether one believes that the Septuagint, that's Greek translation of the Hebrew text that was made in about 250 BC before Christ, and most likely from a slightly different vortex, volage than the Masoretic text, because there's some very, not big differences, but especially with regard to dating, there are some very important differences. And so if we just allow for the possibility that, because these dates in the Septuagint correlate so well with the extra biblical dates, in that case, we can use, for example, with regard to the Great Flood, the Septuagint date, there are actually two different important dates, possible dates, but that's before 3000 BC, 3100, 3300. And that correlates quite well with the date of the flood that is associated with that the flood layer discovered at Ur by Ceruli. Now, in the lower chronology, not of Mesopotamia, but of this earlier period, if you go further back, not from, let's say, the early dynastic period, and so forth, because the further back you go, the more difficult dating gets.
Yeah.
But based on Egyptian tradition, and I'm using I correlate the Mesopotamian tradition with low chronology in Egypt, something quite strange to do. But in that case, we have a low chronological dates for the Uruk period. That's the Great Heroic period, the period that we're talking about. And that was just after the Luz discovered, of which Sir Woolley discussed the evidence. And that date is about 3,500. There's also a higher date that goes back further. But these two dates are, again, very closely correlated. So once we use these dates, we actually find a kind of framework where the biblical tradition and the extra-biblical tradition in ancient Mesopotamia can very nicely be correlated. And then, so I've talked about the literary tradition. So the first writing occurred towards the end of the Uruk period. Now, in my dating, that's about 2,900, 2,950 BC, with Gilgamesh having lived about 2,800 BC. And so that was 2,900, 3,000, 2,900. That was when phonetic writing was discovered. And before that, we just have oral tradition. So the oral tradition was handed down throughout the ages, and many of these great stories were only written down, for example, during the Earth 3 period. That's about 2,100. But remember, because at that early time, they did not have writing, that particular skills in handing down oral tradition correctly. So we, for example, find with Sargon of Akkad, he was the founder of the Akkadian Empire, and his daughter, Enheduanna, she was a very remarkable woman. She wrote 3 poems, among other writings, in honor of the goddess Inanna. And in one of these poems, she directs, she also speak to the poets, that was the ones that would hand down this poem. And she tells them to hand it down verbatim, exactly and precisely, and the technical terminology implies techniques that were used to hand this tradition, this poem down accurately. So this tells us that when we talk about early oral tradition going back to the earlier periods, it's not just make up, stories that you tell around the fireplace. It's definitely not this.
Well, they're like verbal scribes. They had to be as specific as when the scribes would write it down.
Absolutely. So this is also, once we start talking about these things, it becomes, some of the things in the pre-medieval history becomes clear, but we can go into such a lot of detail with regard to that. So that's just to give such an overall view of the background framework that we're talking about. Yeah.
Well, we just recently got back from Turkey. We visited a lot of these ancient sites, such as Göbekli Tepe. We've been telling the story of the return of the Nephilim throughout, going to these places in Greece, in Crete, in Israel, in Jordan. We even found our way to Syria. But you've been doing this before us. You've been going to these specific sites, even Iran, Iraq. How did you get here? What were you doing in these places?
So for my research, I have some very good friends that traveled with me. And what we did was what we call Grail journeys. So we did 7 Grail journeys. And we traveled all across the Middle East and the Mediterranean region and Europe, some countries in Europe, because the Grail story, and as I've said, the Nephilim story is, in my opinion, a continuous tradition. It started from the earliest of period, when it was still an oral tradition. Later on, it was written down, for example, in the Earth 3 period, and we have these great heroic stories, these epic tales of the great Uruk rulers, in Merkar especially, corresponding with the biblical Nimrod. We have the Akkadian rulers, that believed themselves to have been Nephilim of divine descent, especially Sargon, the first one. He was believed to have been born from the sacred marriage, and he's most probably his grandson, but some traditions seem to make him his son, Naram-Sin. He was probably the greatest of all rulers of all time, in my opinion, and only the Roman emperors can be compared. He was a mighty, mighty ruler, and again, the poets told these stories. You know, they had these epic tales about these great rulers, and it was handed down for a long, long time. And so from there, the tradition moved towards Canaan, because after that, the situation in Mesopotamia changed a lot. Many people migrated. In my opinion, a lot of people migrated to Canaan. I've especially as one group that is of special interest to me is the Porteous de Tok. That's the wearers of rings, neck rings. And I link them with the Anakim of the Bible, because the word Anakim can also mean wearers of rings or necklaces. But and there's
the long
also
necked ones. Is some
and there's some figurines that had been found with these neck rings, and at Ugarit and Byblos. There's a lot of evidence, especially with regard to these things. At Ugarit, they discovered, it's a lot to talk about in this regard. So let me just go, don't go too deep into this. So that's just fascinating. On the ground, you go and visit these places, you discover, to get a feel of the place. That's always important. You know, when we traveled in Iran, for example, that was during the Gulf War, and we traveled from the south, and then you travel through 7 mountain ranges towards the north. Now, Meskia and Markar, actually, corresponding with Nimrod, he sent his servant towards the north to the land of Aratta, the ruler of the land of Aratta, and he traveled through these 7 mountain ranges. Now, that was very important because it was symbolic of the 7 heavens.
Yes.
And we traveled through that, and at the end, reaching the land of Aratta, I believe that the Garden of Eden was most likely in those northern areas, the headwaters of the Euphrates and Tigris and other rivers. But anyhow, so doing on the ground, traveling, visiting the places, seeing the people, and at many of the sites that we visited, you'll find information that you will not find in any book.
Yes.
I have a long a list of works, mostly smaller kind of publications, that I've acquired on all my travels throughout the world. And some of them has just such good bits of information about the site. Mostly local archaeologists, people that was involved, and once it's published by some scholar or so, it's good. And I mean, that's the way that eventually it's being done. But often some of the information that we find in these local guides, and especially books by local archaeologists, it's just some information that you find in there. I remember one booklet, for example, that I think we bought it in Byblos. Byblos, that's a fascinating place. I don't know whether you visited Byblos.
No, I haven't been to Lebanon yet. No.
And while reading through it, I just discovered some local folklore about the area, that aligns so beautifully with some of the other aspects, because the myths are also very important, especially the dragon slayer myths. And, the dragon seed eventually, which I associate or is within the ancient framework, the ancient world, it's closely linked with the Nephilim. And many of these things, once when Anna gets that's a better understanding if you have visited the places. Yeah.
Wow. You've in your research, you've written a trilogy of Nephilim books. You've written this 9 Ages of the Nephilim. And one thing that you've already mentioned that I found, this interconnective tissue, is the ruling dynasty of kings are always said to be divine in all these ancient cultures. Egyptian, Sumerian, Akkadian, like you said, they were the progeny of the gods coming down and creating this demigod race, these Nephilim. And it's not an accident, like he said, that this story then spread out, I believe, after Babel, the dispersion of Babel. Then you get the same story with the Egyptians and with all these other different cultures that go along. But this 9 ages of the Nephilim, I find curious. How do you dissect these 9 ages throughout history? I mean, that's a hard thing, but you found it.
Yeah. So at first, it was just studying the topic of the Nephilim, going to many places, researching. And once I've written the trilogy, so the first book focused on the ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerian period, the Akkadian period, and also Egypt, the old kingdom period and period before that, from the pre-dynastic period and so forth. And then with the second book, I moved to Canaan and the Mediterranean region, in all the countries and the places related to those traditions, and eventually Europe. The third book is about the Grail and the Grail families, dynasties, and Europe and so on. And in the process, I discovered, usually the stories of the Nephilim can be understood sort of as ad hoc, stories that you find, for example, in Greek tradition, Hercules or Perseus or whoever. It seems like, ad hoc dynasties. Now, we have the Hercules actually at a dynasty that believed that they were descended from Hercules himself, the Heracleidae.
Yes.
And what I have shown in my research is that Hercules is just a Greek adaptation of Naram Sin that I've spoken about earlier, with elements of the story of Sargon incorporated, because the mythos of Sargon and Naram Sin have become very much interwoven in what I call the king god tradition. For example, in the Rephaim text at Ugarit and so forth, it's a very long story. But anyhow, so these traditions eventually reached the Mediterranean. So there's this possibility that these Heracleidae actually were a long line of a long dynasty that traced the origins back to the Akkadian, the great Akkadians, and the Akkadians were Kishites. They traced their tradition back, and eventually we can align that also with some Sumerian traditions. It's a continuous tradition. It's not an ad hoc tradition.
Yes.
So there's a continuous. I'm more interested in tradition.
Yeah.
I'm not so interested in proving anything that the Nephilim really lived or whatsoever. I'm interested in the traditions, the stories about the Nephilim and how it was handed down, and how all these, from the one place to the next place to the next place, and then on the ground, you'll find, for example, I've mentioned the wearers of rings. What is that?
Yes.
Dogs, for example, and and especially later on at Thebes in Greece, it's there we had the Spartoi, and they were believed to have been giants. They were seen as dragon seed. And again, on the ground, traditions that's so similar and closely related to what we found in Mesopotamia. So migration, not Mesopotamia, Canaan. So a large part of my work also concerned migrations.
Yes.
And with that, how the cults developed and was taken from one place to another, how the myths were handed down, especially the dragon slayer myth, how the iconography, how we can trace that, how it developed, and with these migrations, the evidence for migration, the archaeology, the literary traditions about these things. It was a very comprehensive study. And eventually, the book 9 Ages is sort of a reflection on the trilogy. And in that, I discovered I can actually divide it into 9 ages.
That's incredible. I think today, if you ask the average person about this, and most people have never heard of Nephilim, some have, they do look at it as a fairy tale or as a one-off. And I think, unfortunately, that's both lazy and prideful to think that something before our time period that we could fathom couldn't exist or couldn't be a part of history. And that's why I love the work that you've done, because it connects and it shows this ongoing history and lineage that wasn't just one person's fairy tale or just that really weird movie we saw one time. But here's the big question, and we talk a lot about this in our series on Return of the Nephilim. What does all of this matter for today? If this stuff existed, if there was, the progeny of men and women and gods and all of this stuff, we have all of these things, why does it matter to us today? I don't see any Nephilim around us. I don't see any giants on earth, all this kind of stuff.
It depends on why you understand. How you understand Nephilim? Because I show is Nephilim was definitely not giants, not only giants.
Yes.
We do have traditions about giants, but if you go back to the ancient world, you'll find the giants, but you'll also find other great kings and rulers that were definitely not giants, was believed to be Nephilim.
Yes.
Take, for example, demigods in the Greek tradition. Hercules. Yes. We've mentioned Hercules. So he was very strong, but he was not a giant. And so there was, once we start discussing the Nephilim in more detail, one find that there's, for example, in Genesis 6, verse 4, we read that it were men of renown. It's quite interesting. It's often overlooked. It's should have read, according to some interpreters, it should read the giants of renown. But it's men of renown. I mean, so, and that, so that's, in my opinion, it's more complex. Definitely, we have the traditions about giants, but at the same time, we have a priestly tradition and we have a kingly tradition. And within the framework of the kingly tradition, now the priestly tradition goes back to the Apkallu, the sages of ancient Mesopotamia. And within the kingly tradition, that's where we have these great rulers, great heroes. And for example, Nimrod, or in Merkar, later on the Akkadians and so forth. And now what is interesting regarding your question is, from the earliest of times, we find two opposing traditions. And that's from extra biblical sources. So once we take the biblical perspective, we can align not only the historical perspective from a chronological base. We can not only align the different personages that we believe were the same people. We can also find that many of the biblical motives were also present in the ancient world. For example, the seed of the snake. That's a fascinating aspect mentioned in Genesis. So what we find is basically two traditions from the earliest of times throughout history. And I followed this Nephilim tradition later on to Rome, Imperial Rome, the Julius Caesar, for example. He was basically the one that brought the Republic to an end. He believed himself to have been descended from Zeus or Jupiter in the Greek tradition, from Venus and from Mars. So he believed, and again, it's not an ad hoc idea, because we have a continuous tradition, going back to Troy. And before that, the Etruscans and where they originate. So suddenly, so many aspects of migration becomes important, following their stories. And eventually I followed them into Europe, and where a group, for example, like the Merovingians were definitely regarded as Nephilim. They, Merovingi's mother, she went for a swim in the sea, and it so happened while she was swimming that this Quinotaur, nobody knows what a Quinotaur is, but the Christian author, I think he didn't want to, use blatantly pagan language. So now he had this story about the Quinotaur actually came with her, and she then, as a consequence, she gave birth to Meruvi. So he was of supernatural descent. He was descended from the gods. And the Merovingians is a fascinating story on their own, and how their family continued the dynasty after the end of the rule. Certain families believed themselves to have been direct lineal descendants, not necessarily in the male line, because they also regarded female. During even the Merovingian period, you could be an heiress in the female line and continue the line. And that's where the basis for the Grail romances. That's a long story. But eventually we arrive at our present day. And because these families and the groups associated with them, for example, the Rosicrucians and the impact that they had, for example, also on Freemasonry, it's a complex story. And many of these players are with us today. And with regard to the return of the Nephilim, I believe we should actually go to the book of Revelation, and there we have a lot of information about the return of the Nephilim. I believe that the angel of the abyss that's left out and all these diamonds, that's exactly the Nephilim, because this again, the mythos in Revelation, there's a lot of mythical themes that's extremely old. And the Bible is not, as we've already said, it's not written in isolation. And these myths and mythos, if one understand that and see how in the ancient world it developed, then we can identify this angel. It's none other than the king god I've mentioned earlier, because he was the follower of the diamonds in all these traditions in Canaan. For example, in the Rephaim texts, he's called MLK. That's king, king of old. And he leads the Rephaim. And that's where Moloch and all these derivative terminology developed, and he became a god on his own terms. But at first, he was a Rephaim, and Rephaim, that's topic on its own, but actually referred to a royal kingly diamonds associated with the kingly line. And so we find a continuous tradition that eventually also appears in biblical tradition in the book of Revelation. And here we have the time of their return and they're coming back. Yes, eventually.
Yeah, well, it never ended. You know, why it was so important for these royal line of kings, you know, which would become the Holy Roman Empire here, and even you find it in the Roman Catholic Church with the popes and all these different intermingling of seed. But like you said, the serpent seed is an important living plot point from Genesis 3:15 that prophetic conflict between the seed of a woman, which would eventually become Messiah, and the seed of a serpent. And these kings, I even see, like you mentioned in Revelation and in Daniel, you see these 10 kings that appear to be a part of this conglomerate of a statue, Nebuchadnezzar's vision of a statue, ancient Roman Empire, the revived Roman Empire, you know, Holy Roman. All these kings seem to be divine also. They seem to be Nephilim as well. And then you have this one king, this little horn that rises up, the beast. And the description of a beast is also like a chimera, a Nephilim, a mixing of seed and genetics. And all this seems to be is Satan's very complex plan throughout the ages to try to halt Messiah's return. First to halt Messiah's first coming, and then to halt Messiah's second coming. Is that what you're seeing?
I agree. Absolutely agree with you. You know, so the beast, in my opinion, if you read in Revelation chapter 11, it clearly states that he was the one, the angel of the abyss. It's just now called the beast, came forth from the abyss. And here now suddenly he's described as a great ruler, especially in chapter 13, conquering the world and so forth. And in my opinion, He is basically a Nephilim Messiah. So what I found from the earliest of times, the concept of the Messiah was not only associated with later on with biblical tradition. In ancient Mesopotamia, the idea of the Messiah was already developed. And it was also associated with the Nephilim lineage. So some of these very important and great people, for example, Naram Sin, I have no doubt that he was a messianic figure similar to Jesus Christ, but in the opposing line.
Wow.
And so he's a kind of Nephilim Messiah. The same with Augustus, so much later.
Wow.
If you take Augustus and you take Naram Sin's, the two historical traditions, it's amazing. I discuss this in detail in my second book, how that corresponds and how both were worshipped during their own lifetime as gods. Temples were built for them, for their worship. They had priests serving in these temples during their own lifetimes in the official religion of the time. They are just, it's so, and they're the similar kind of people in so many aspects. Nephilim kind of the tradition that belongs to the Nephilim. That's how we should understand them. And eventually, I believe the return of the Antichrist will be, we should understand him in exactly the same terms. And the ages that I have also divided the story within, but that's a story for another day. I found from the earliest of times that there was a cosmic code. Sumerians had a cosmic code. They believed, they talk quite a lot about the writing in the night sky. And the sages, they decrypted this writing. And the earliest sages, the important role that they had was to apply what they found in the night sky on earth. So that's why, the Nephilim were closely linked with the gods, because seen as descendants of the gods, and the gods were associated with certain stars. Yes. So this is quite an extensive story. And I believe that this idea of a cosmic code is not only restricted to the Nephilim. I believe that there's a wider story that even includes the biblical narrative, because in both Isaiah and in Revelation, we read that the heavens is like a scroll.
Yes.
And the wise men knowing about the birth of the baby Jesus. So, there's layers on layers of mystery and amazing stuff that I think should be unpacked. It's important for our day. And once we understand these things better, we also know what to expect in our own time, how things will unfold.
I want to go more into that cosmic code, because you mentioned the gods being associated with stars. We see that with Jupiter, Mars, Venus, all that in the more modern, later Mediterranean traditions, but even going back before that. We get in Genesis 6 and we see them, like you mentioned, Dr. Michael Heiser earlier when we were discussing this divine council of ruling gods. They seem to be a different breed, a different form of creation that God made, even calling them his own sons, that they ruled at this council, at this mount of congregation at the very top with El Elyon, the Most High God. And they end up rebelling, or at least a portion of them rebel, which they come down and mate and have the Nephilim. But those gods seem to be important, and we also see them return in Revelation. These four angels that are bound at the river Euphrates, being the same connection with these B'nai Elohim that are bound, that Peter mentions, bound in Tartarus, and Jude mentions, and the same story we see connected. How is this important with the gods, and even with your idea and your understanding of quantum physics, nuclear physics, the rolling up of the scroll? There's something more to this, that they were co-ruling in the heavens with God. And I'm sure we could go down crazy rabbit trails, but I just want to hear a little bit of your understanding of this.
Yeah. So again, the Bible did not originate in isolation. So the divine council is an old concept. We find it in the Bible, but we also find it, for example, at Ugarit, in the Ugarit texts that date to about, say, 1400 to 1200 BC, more or less. And even further back in Sumerian tradition, we have the divine council. Now, the father of the gods, there's certain concepts in the council that's of importance. The one is the father of the gods, the other is the king of the gods.
Yes.
So, for example, in Psalm 82, El Elyon,
yes,
we find that he's described as, the gods are described as his children. So he is here in this psalm, he's regarded as the father of the gods, definitely. And we find the same kind of terminology. In fact, El Elyon is also found in the Ugarit texts. And in the earliest of times in Sumer, we had the supreme god. So they had the definite distinction between the supreme god, the father of the gods, and the other gods. The supreme god was called An by the Sumerians, which means heaven or highly elevated, or the most high one. And the cuneiform symbol for that was just a star with 4 wedges. Now, this particular sign could also be used as a determinative. That means a category for certain names, for example, the gods. So all the different gods that came after An had this determinative behind or before the name. That tells us this is a god. But when it comes to An, he didn't add it, not in the earlier period. He was God.
Yes.
And the other were gods. So you find that already in the earliest of tradition. Wow. And now the Anunnaki, that's basically means the seed of the prince.
Yes.
Now, prince at that early period was An, was regarded as the prince. Later on, Enki, the Lord of the Earth, also got that title. But originally and at first, they were then the seed of An. That's the sons of An. So that's the equivalent of what we find later on at Ugarit, the sons of El. Now, El and An is exact equivalence.
Wow.
So in the earliest of periods, for example, in Ebla, it's another city, very old city, and they discovered the Ebla texts, and El is actually mentioned in the Ebla texts. So we know that the Semites called him El, and the Sumerians called him An. And because once this very old tradition enters history within the framework of writing, he was called more generally An in Mesopotamia. But definitely, I have no doubt that originally the Semites called him El. So that's from the earliest of time. And what we have is the divine council from that time. He was the father of the gods. And then we had a kind of rebellion within this framework, because there's a tradition about the seed of the supreme god that fell on the ground. That is the oldest layer of mythos that's associated with the gods, the seed that fell on the ground. And later on, it became closely associated with Enki, with his seed that fell on the ground. There's a whole story about it, Enki's seed, and the gods that were born from that. But so what we find here is these gods, the gods of the earth, were then later on associated with the burial mounds. Yeah, for example, I can maybe I have a quotation from the death of Gilgamesh. That's the epic. And in this case, we read about the Anuna of the Holy Mount. That's the burial mounds. The Nungals, that's the Igigi of the Holy Mount. So what we have here is that the Anunnaki were not only the gods in the Supreme Council, in the Council of the Gods. They were also the sons of God. They are Anunnaki, they're sons of God. But they were also now associated with diamonds, actually, because such a close link here between the diamonds and the gods, because they are in the burial mounds. So this is the basis of what we later on, for example, in the book of Enoch, we read about the demons that originated from the Nephilim. And the diamonds of Greek tradition, and in both Greek and biblical tradition, they also called watches. Now, if you go to the biblical tradition, what is very, very interesting in the biblical tradition is that we find something very, very similar. Take, for example, a passage that I can mention in Deuteronomy, in chapter 32, verse 17. Now, here we have the diamonds, but now they call demons. In the biblical tradition, the Shedim. And the Shedim in this case is correlated, and one can even say identified with the gods, the Elohim. This passage I can just read from the New King James. They sacrificed to demons, that's Shedim, not to God. To gods, that's the Elohim, that's the same terminology that we find in Psalm 82. They did not know. To new gods, new arrivals that your fathers did not fear. So what we find in this case, and I think this is very, very important, is that the diamonds, the Shedim, and the Elohim, the gods, are not that far from each other. The fallen gods, once they somehow landed up in the burial graves, maybe because of the Nephilim and when they died, etc., because that's the tradition of the Greeks. And they were reborn within these families via the sacred marriage ritual. That's what they believed. So I think this gives some background as to the biblical idea of the sons of God that had relations with the daughters of men. This is an old tradition from the earliest of times in ancient Sumer. Yeah.
Wow. And we've seen those burial mounds. We saw them everywhere in Greece. In
Europe.
We've seen those burial
you visited
mounds.
Crete?
Crete. Yep. We went to
beautiful,
Knossos
isn't
and
it?
Festos.
Yeah. Some beautiful
amazing
examples. Yeah. And if you go to Bahrain, that's the Dilmun of the ancient world. I don't know whether you visited that place.
No.
It's beautiful. And you have this, it's like a graveyard that's endless. It just keeps on going. It's magnificent. It's just amazing. They actually believe that Dilmun represented the netherworld in the ancient time.
Yes.
So from Sumer, you can go through the 7 mountains to the north, which represent the 7 heavens. And it was actually based on the idea of the 7 planets, the circles, and that was the basis for the idea of 7 heavens. And then you can travel to the south, as Gilgamesh did in the Gilgamesh epic, to Dilmun. And he found the Sumerian Noah and his wife, living there. And it's just a mythological kind of religious perspective of them being in the netherworld. So this is basically...
Interesting.
They actually had different sanctuaries that represented certain cosmic realms, like the netherworld, for example. Yeah.
That's fascinating because... and I want you to speak to this, understanding quantum physics and dimensionally and all that. Obviously, we've known, we mentioned before when we were talking, our former pastor, when we were younger, was a nuclear physicist, and he understood quantum physics, and he talked about the different dimensional states of heaven, the 7 layers of heaven, as you mentioned, and even the lower dimensional states of what would be Sheol, Hell, Tartarus, the pit, all these different, layers before even Abraham's bosom, that we read in the biblical text. These all seem to be very real in the biblical text, that these fallen angels, these fallen B'nai Elohim who sinned, are then bound in Tartarus in these lower levels of punishment, and there's different levels of punishment according to the different sins that they committed. Can we see that in science? Can we see different dimensional states that mirror the biblical and the traditional texts?
Yeah, Caleb, you are now moving to a topic we can discuss. We can have a very long discussion on this one, but we'll really need time for this. I'm afraid it's just, just to jump in like this and give a solid answer.
Yeah. I got greedy.
All that I can say is I believe that the netherworld, heaven, and so forth, it's definitely not situated, obviously, in our material world.
Yes.
But in a different, let's call it a dimension. But what that exactly means, that's where the interesting discussion actually would originate, where we can start, But so definitely, I believe that,
The good news is, even though we don't have time today to be able to delve into all of this, because I'm assuming it took you more than a few minutes to study and write whatnot, you have materials that people who are interested in this topic can deep dive into. I know that we've looked at some of your materials in preparing for today. And again, if you're watching this and you're wondering, why does this apply to me? I thought I'd just focus on Jesus and everything else goes okay. Yes, put your focus on Jesus, most definitely. But he's also asked you to be wise as a serpent while you're being harmless as a dove. And to be wise, you need to understand a few things. That's what I love about history. When you study history and you realize that there is no accidents, that God orchestrated this amazing system of events while the enemy was trying to orchestrate his system of events. And we see that no matter what the enemy does, God wins in the end, but we play a part in what happens next. And that's what is so important about studying the Nephilim, about studying what's happened, where it's going. And also, I just think it's really cool. Like, there's so much, you talk about the fact that there's all this portion of history before we could write things down, that people's literal job as an orator was to exactly memorize this poetry to be able to share history, and yet it's still made it to this day right now, 2026. I love all of this, and I love that your life and your work has given us so much insight into this. How can people find your work? How can they study more and learn more from what you've done?
Yeah, so my my books are available on Amazon, the trilogy and 9 Ages, and also the Dragon Seed, which I also regard as a very important book. And then also on academia.edu, a professional page. Some of my articles are listed, or not unlisted. You can also download them, and so you can also go there. And then I've also
your website?
I also have a website. No, I don't have a website.
Okay.
But I have a blog, Willem McLoud, wmcloud.blogspot.com.
Okay.
And then we also have just started with a YouTube channel, 9 Ages, 9 and 10 Ages.
Oh, nice.
Where we also discussed the Nephilim and all the relevant stuff regarding the ancient world. So to me, it's just, it's once you have a better understanding of how all these things come together, suddenly the Bible, you look at the Bible with different eyes, It's not a book that's not relevant or is sort of written in isolation. It's suddenly a book that the more you delve in it, the more you find substantial evidence and support, and it's within the framework of the ancient world. It fits perfectly.
Yes.
And that makes a big difference once one starts looking at the Bible in that way.
Wow. Willem, we're going to have you on again because your endless understanding, I believe it needs to be known by the world. I believe what you have uncovered, the work that you put into it is meant to be passed down to younger generations so that we don't forget what has been forgotten, but has been chronicled and left behind for our understanding. Absolutely, but thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure.
Yes. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.